There is a violence that happens inside the body that no one talks about. It is quiet, necessary sometimes, but violent nonetheless. When antibiotics move through your system, they do not discriminate. They do not pause to consider which bacteria are keeping you alive and which are making you sick. They sweep through like a flood, indiscriminate and absolute, leaving behind a landscape stripped of the complexity that once sustained you. And in that emptiness, something shifts. I'm Dr. Will Bulsiewicz. Most people call me Dr. B. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist, and my work is focused on helping people. The body does not feel the same afterward. Energy becomes elusive. Digestion turns unpredictable. Mood darkens without reason. Skin rebels. Sleep fragments. And you are left wondering what changed, why the medication that saved you from infection also left you feeling fundamentally altered, as though some invisible contract between you and your body has been broken. This is not imagination. This is biology. The gut microbiome, that vast internal ecosystem of trillions of organisms living in symbiotic relationship with your cells, does not recover automatically after antibiotics. It does not simply reset to its previous state once the medication stops. Species disappear, diversity collapses, and in the vacant territory left behind, opportunistic organisms move in. Organisms that do not serve your health, that do not produce the metabolites your gut lining needs to stay intact, that do not communicate with your brain in ways that support clarity and calm. The ecosystem destabilizes. And when the gut destabilizes, everything connected to it begins to fracture. Immunity weakens, inflammation rises, metabolism becomes confused, neurotransmitter production falters. The signals between your gut and your brain, signals that govern hunger, mood, motivation, and mental sharpness, become garbled and unreliable. Most people do not understand this connection. They take antibiotics and feel grateful for the relief from infection. They notice digestive discomfort afterward and assume it will pass. They attribute the fatigue to stress, the brain fog to lack of sleep, the bloating to something they ate. They do not realize they are experiencing the downstream consequences of an ecological collapse happening silently inside them. And because the medical system rarely addresses this, because doctors prescribe antibiotics without equally prescribing a restoration protocol, millions of people walk around with depleted microbiomes, wondering why they feel worse than they did before, why their body seems to have turned against them without explanation. But the body has not turned against you. It is responding logically to an altered internal environment. And that environment can be restored, not instantly, not through a single supplement or a week of clean eating, but through deliberate, patient reconstruction of the microbial diversity that was lost. Through specific foods that feed the right organisms, that signal to the gut lining to heal, that reintroduce complexity into a system that has been simplified to the point of dysfunction. There are foods that do this work better than anything else, not because they are trendy or exotic, but because they align with the biological needs of a recovering ecosystem. And understanding what these foods are, why they work, and how to integrate them into daily life is the difference between lingering in post-antibiotic depletion and genuinely rebuilding the foundation of long-term health. The first food is not a food in the traditional sense. It is a category, a biological strategy disguised as vegetables, legumes, whole grains, fruits, nuts, and seeds. It is fiber. But not fiber as you have been taught to think about it. Not fiber as roughage or as something that helps you feel full or keeps digestion regular. Fiber is a signal. It is the primary communication system between you and the organisms that sustain you. When you consume fiber, you are not nourishing yourself directly. Human cells cannot digest fiber. It passes through your stomach and small intestine largely untouched, arriving in the colon where the real transformation occurs. There, resident bacteria ferment fiber into short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, acetate, and propionate. These molecules are not waste products. They are medicine produced inside your own body. Butyrate is the molecule your gut lining depends on to survive. The cells that form the barrier between the contents of your intestines and your bloodstream use butyrate as their primary fuel source. When butyrate levels are adequate, the gut lining remains strong, intact, selective. It allows nutrients to pass through while keeping toxins, undigested food particles, and bacteria out of the bloodstream. But when butyrate levels drop, as they do after antibiotics destroy the bacteria that produce it, the gut lining begins to break down. The tight junctions between cells loosen, permeability increases, and substances that should never enter the bloodstream begin to leak through, triggering an immune response that manifests as chronic low-grade inflammation. This is not a disease. This is a logical biological consequence of an ecosystem that has lost the organisms capable of producing the molecules that maintain structural integrity. After antibiotics, butyrate production collapses. The bacteria responsible for fermenting fiber into butyrate are among the most vulnerable to antibiotic damage, and when they disappear, the gut lining begins to deteriorate even if you are eating well, even if you feel fine, even if you have no obvious digestive symptoms. Inflammation creeps upward. The immune system, which resides primarily in the gut and relies on microbial training to function properly, becomes hyperreactive. It begins to attack things it should tolerate. Food sensitivities develop. Autoimmune processes activate. Metabolic signaling becomes dysregulated, and the person experiences this as fatigue, as brain fog, as unexplained weight gain or loss, as skin problems, as mood instability, without ever connecting it back to the missing bacteria in their gut. Restoring butyrate production requires feeding the organisms that produce it. And those organisms thrive on diversity. They do not respond well to a limited diet, even if that diet is healthy. They need variety. They need different types of fiber from different plant sources because different fibers feed different microbial species. A diet centered on the same 5 or 6 foods, no matter how nutritious those foods are, creates a monoculture in the gut. And monocultures are fragile. They collapse under stress. They cannot adapt to change. They lack the resilience that comes from complexity. After antibiotics, the goal is not to eat perfectly. It is to eat diversely, to introduce as many different plant foods as possible into the weekly rotation: leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, root vegetables, berries, apples, legumes, lentils, chickpeas, oats, barley, quinoa, nuts, seeds, herbs, spices. Each one carries a unique profile of fibers and polyphenols that nourish specific microbial communities. This is not about overwhelming yourself with restrictions or rigid meal plans. It is about gradual expansion, adding one new plant food per week, rotating vegetables instead of defaulting to the same ones, choosing whole grains over refined grains when possible, keeping frozen vegetables and canned legumes on hand so that variety is accessible even when fresh options are limited. The more diverse your intake, the more diverse your microbiome becomes. And diversity is resilience. It is the difference between a gut that can withstand stress, medication, dietary lapses, and travel, and a gut that destabilizes at the slightest disruption. The second food is ancient. It predates refrigeration, industrial agriculture, and the modern obsession with sterility. It is food that has been intentionally transformed by microbes, food that contains living organisms capable of temporarily colonizing the gut, communicating with resident species, and influencing immune function. Fermented foods. Sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, kefir, miso, tempeh, traditional pickles, kombucha. These are not supplements. They are not pharmaceutical interventions. They are foods that have been consumed by human populations for thousands of years, not because they were trendy, but because they were necessary. Fermentation preserved food before refrigeration existed. It made nutrients more bioavailable. It introduced beneficial bacteria into the diet as a natural consequence of the preservation process. And in doing so, it supported the microbial diversity that modern sanitation and food processing have systematically eliminated. After antibiotics, the gut is not just depleted, it is also vulnerable to colonization by organisms that do not serve your health. Opportunistic bacteria, yeast, and other microbes that thrive in low diversity environments move into the vacant ecological niches left behind. They do not produce butyrate. They do not support the gut lining. They do not communicate with the brain in ways that promote calm or clarity. Instead, they produce metabolites that increase inflammation, disrupt metabolic signaling, and send cravings for the very foods that sustain them: sugar, refined carbohydrates, processed fats. This is why people often experience intense sugar cravings after antibiotics. It is not a failure of willpower, it is microbial signaling. The organisms that survive the antibiotics are sending messages to the brain, messages that prioritize their survival over your health. Fermented foods disrupt this process. They introduce beneficial microbes that compete with opportunistic organisms for resources and space. They stimulate the production of mucus that protects the gut lining. They modulate immune responses, training the immune system to distinguish between harmless bacteria and genuine threats. They produce metabolites that reduce inflammation and support neurotransmitter production. And they do this gently, incrementally, without the aggressive colonization that sometimes occurs with high-dose probiotic supplements. Fermented foods do not force change. They invite it. They create an environment where beneficial organisms can thrive while making it harder for harmful ones to dominate. The key is consistency and gradual introduction. The gut that has just been through antibiotics is sensitive. It is not primed for large servings of fermented foods immediately. A small amount, a tablespoon of sauerkraut, or a few spoonfuls of yogurt is enough to begin the process. The goal is not to flood the system, but to gently reintroduce microbial complexity. Over days and weeks, as tolerance builds, servings can increase. The body adapts, the immune system recalibrates, and the microbial ecosystem begins to shift toward a state that supports rather than undermines health. This is not a quick fix. It is ecological restoration applied to the human body. And like all restoration work, it requires patience, consistency, and trust in the process. What matters is not the specific type of fermented food, but the regular inclusion of these foods in the diet. Different fermented foods contain different strains of bacteria, and that diversity is beneficial. Rotating between sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, kefir, and miso throughout the week provides a broader spectrum of microbial exposure than relying on a single source. And for those who cannot tolerate dairy, there are non-dairy options: coconut yogurt, water kefir, fermented vegetables. The variety is wider than most people realize. The barrier is not availability, it is awareness. It is understanding that these foods are not peripheral additions to a healthy diet, but central components of microbial restoration. The third food is the one most people overlook because it does not fit the modern conception of nutrition. It is not about macronutrients or calorie density or protein content. It is about chemical complexity and the biological communication that occurs when plants defend themselves. Polyphenols. These are the compounds that give plants their color, their bitterness, their astringency. They are found in berries, dark leafy greens, green tea, coffee, dark chocolate, nuts, seeds, olive oil, herbs, spices. They are not essential nutrients in the traditional sense. You will not develop a deficiency disease if you do not consume them, but your microbiome will suffer because polyphenols are not absorbed efficiently in the small intestine. Most of them reach the colon intact, where gut bacteria metabolize them into bioactive compounds that reduce inflammation, protect the gut lining, support cardiovascular health, and influence gene expression. Polyphenols are prebiotic. They feed beneficial bacteria. They promote the growth of species that produce butyrate, that strengthen the gut barrier, that communicate with the immune system in ways that reduce autoimmune activation and metabolic dysfunction. And they do something else that is rarely discussed. They create selective pressure in the gut. They favor the growth of organisms that can metabolize complex plant compounds while inhibiting the growth of organisms that thrive on simple sugars and processed foods. In this way, a diet rich in polyphenols gradually reshapes the microbiome toward a composition that supports long-term health, not through force, but through biological incentive. After antibiotics, polyphenol intake becomes even more critical because the microbial species that metabolize these compounds are often among those most affected by antibiotic use. When they disappear, the body loses access to the anti-inflammatory and protective benefits that their metabolites provide. Inflammation increases, oxidative stress rises. The risk of chronic disease begins to climb even in the absence of obvious symptoms. But when polyphenol-rich foods are reintroduced consistently, the bacteria capable of metabolizing them begin to recover. Their populations grow. They produce metabolites that calm inflammation, protect cells from damage, and support the intricate signaling networks that govern everything from blood sugar regulation to mood stability. This is not about eating exotic superfoods or spending large amounts of money on rare ingredients. Polyphenols are abundant in everyday foods. A cup of blueberries, a handful of walnuts, a drizzle of olive oil, a cup of green tea, a square of dark chocolate, fresh herbs like parsley, cilantro, and basil, spices like turmeric, cinnamon, and ginger. These are not supplements. They are foods that have been part of human diets for centuries, foods that traditional cultures consumed not because they understood the biochemistry, but because they tasted good, because they were available, because they made people feel better in ways that were intuitive rather than scientifically explained. The work of rebuilding the gut after antibiotics is not about perfection. It is about direction. It is about understanding that every meal is an opportunity to send a signal to the ecosystem within you, a signal that either supports recovery or perpetuates depletion. And those signals accumulate. One serving of fermented food will not transform the microbiome, but one serving most days, over weeks and months, creates a pattern. One diverse, fiber-rich meal will not restore butyrate production, but consistent, diverse eating day after day rebuilds the microbial communities that produce it. One cup of polyphenol-rich tea will not reverse inflammation, but daily intake of polyphenol-containing foods gradually shifts the internal environment toward a state that protects rather than damages. This is the truth that the modern wellness industry does not want you to understand. Healing is not dramatic. It is not instantaneous. It does not come from a single supplement, a single food, a single protocol. It comes from the patient accumulation of small choices that align with the biological needs of the body. It comes from recognizing that you are not separate from the microbes that live within you, that your health is inseparable from their health, and that restoring them requires the same principles that govern ecological restoration anywhere: diversity, consistency, time, and the willingness to trust that systems can heal when given the right conditions. The body does not demand perfection, it demands consistency. It responds to patterns, not to isolated events. A single day of processed food will not undo weeks of gut-supportive eating. A single stressful week will not destroy a well-established microbiome. But chronic patterns create chronic outcomes. And the tragedy is that most people live in chronic depletion without realizing it, cycling through symptoms that seem unrelated, treating each one individually, never recognizing the common root beneath them all: a gut ecosystem that has been systematically damaged by antibiotics, by ultra-processed foods, by chronic stress, by lack of sleep, by environmental toxins, and by the absence of the foods that would allow it to recover. You are not broken. Your fatigue is not laziness. Your brain fog is not incompetence. Your bloating is not punishment. Your anxiety is not weakness. These are biological responses to an environment that does not support the organisms that support you. And that environment can change, not through willpower, not through restriction, but through the deliberate, compassionate practice of nourishing the foundation, through fiber that feeds butyrate-producing bacteria, through fermented foods that reintroduce microbial diversity, through polyphenols that reduce inflammation and promote the growth of protective species, through sleep that allows the gut to repair, through stress management that prevents the dysregulation of gut-brain communication, through the understanding that health is not a destination you reach and then abandon, but a relationship you cultivate every single day. The timeline is longer than you want it to be. The gut does not heal in a week or a month. It heals over months and years, slowly rebuilding the complexity that was lost, gradually restoring the communication networks that were severed, patiently reestablishing the resilience that allows the body to withstand stress without collapsing into dysfunction. And during that time, there will be setbacks. There will be days when symptoms return, when progress feels invisible, when doubt creeps in and whispers that nothing is changing. This is when most people quit. This is when they decide that gut health is too complicated, too slow, too demanding. This is when they return to the habits that depleted them in the first place, not because they lack discipline, but because they lack the understanding that healing is not linear, that the body does not announce its progress loudly, that recovery happens beneath the surface long before it becomes visible. But if you stay with it, if you continue to make the choices that support rather than undermine the ecosystem within you, the body will respond. Energy will return, not all at once, but in gradual increments that accumulate into sustained vitality. Mental clarity will sharpen, digestion will stabilize, inflammation will quiet, mood will lift, cravings will shift, and you will begin to feel, perhaps for the first time in years, that your body is working with you rather than against you, that it is capable, that it is resilient, that it was never broken, only depleted, and that depletion, when addressed with patience and intention, is reversible. This is not a promise of cure. It is not a guarantee that every symptom will disappear or that you will never feel unwell again. It is the recognition that the gut is the foundation, that the microbiome is the command center, and that when you prioritize its restoration, everything downstream improves. Not because you forced it to, but because you created the conditions that allowed it to, because you understood that food is information, that every meal rewrites the internal code, and that the organisms within you are listening, adapting, responding to what you give them. The choice is always yours to continue living in depletion, wondering why the body feels unreliable, or to begin the slow, deliberate work of restoration, to feed the organisms that weaken you, or to feed the ones that protect you, to see eating as a chore, or to see it as an act of biological communication, to demand instant results, or to trust the timeline of healing, to treat your gut as an afterthought, or to recognize it as the invisible architect of your health, your mood, your energy, your resilience, and your capacity to live fully in the body you were given. Your gut can heal, the bacteria can return, the diversity can rebuild, the inflammation can quiet, the energy can stabilize, the clarity can return. But it will not happen by accident. It will happen because you chose every day to nourish the foundation, because you understood that fiber, fermentation, and polyphenols are not trends, but biological necessities, because you trusted that small choices, repeated consistently, create profound change, because you recognize that healing is not a single event, but a practice, a relationship, a way of living that honors the complexity within you. That is the work. That is the path. And it begins now with the next meal, the next choice, the next moment of intention. The body is waiting, the organisms are ready, and the possibility of restoration is always, always within reach.